Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to my channel. My name is Paul, the Canadian Snowman, here once again with another cool video. Hopefully, which country had the most effective tanks in World War II? We believe we just did recently, who had the most effective, fighter planes of World War II. And yeah, at least in the video, the Americans came out number one. And so now we're doing tanks. I played some World of Tanks on Xbox a little bit, and I remember seeing all the countries, the tanks you could choose from, and you start a line, and trying to think of which. I don't know. I feel like I should go guess. I'm gonna go with the Germans having the best tank for some reason. For some reason, I'm gonna guess because I think that was one of the main lines I picked during that. I forget the name of the tanks. I think maybe it wasn't Germans. I remember using the Tiger tank, and I don't know if it was any good or not. I don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about now. But anyways, let's jump in this and check it out. Please hit that like and subscribe button below, and yeah. Like I said, guys, don't expect a video every day. I can get them out when I can. So you guys just have to bear with me. The 3, 2, 1, bam.
Tanks were first developed and introduced to the front lines in the Great War. This was in direct response.
Yeah, that's right, in World War One. And just think, man, if you were a soldier back in those days, and that was right when they first started in World War One, when they first started using modern combat. They weren't walking in straight lines with bright, shiny uniforms. That's when they actually jumped into kind of camouflage. But imagine seeing one of those for the first time. What the heck is that? Look, you think it's some kind of dragon, coming across, and you probably feel pretty helpless considering if you fired on it, nothing would probably happen because the thing looked like a monster. But anyways, we're on World War II. Sorry.
Response to the stalemate into which the Western Front had devolved. Some tank designs and prototypes had already been in the works for decades prior to the First World War. Some of these include an 1855 proposal for a steam-powered land ram, which was basically an armoured tractor mounted with a cannon. Yet it was the alarmingly...
You guys were thinking flying saucer, weren't you? There's no way you didn't see that and said that looks like a flying saucer. I was thinking hey, flying saucer on land, the tank saucer.
Basically an armoured tractor mounted with a cannon. Yet it was the alarmingly high number of casualties caused by trench warfare on the Western Front that propelled the creation of the first tanks. The first tanks ever built, the heavy British Mark I, were introduced to the battlefield for the first time on September 15, 1916, during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, supporting British infantry as they advanced. Although their mere presence on the battlefield had great shock value and caused fear within German ranks, their design was still lacking and their reliability was low, and many of the tanks sent to battle broke down due to mechanical failures, mainly broken tracks. Yeah. Nevertheless, with this offensive, the British achieved the longest advance since trench warfare began in 1914. In spite of those facts, it was in World War II that the tank would take center stage. Following up on the lessons learned from the Great War, European nations started to modernize their armies in the interwar period, giving rise to motorized infantry and tank divisions. Tanks would eventually take on a major role in the outcome of World War II, as battlefield supremacy depended heavily on both the number and the quality of tanks available to each side. The importance of tanks in World War II was such that several of the largest tank battles in history were fought during this time, immortalizing some of the tanks that fought on either side. In today's video, we're going to assess which country had the most effective tanks in World War II. Some of the criteria used for this assessment are the thickness of the tank's armor, the caliber of its gun, its speed, its affordability, and of course, how effectively they performed on the battlefield. Also, we'll only be covering some of the major nations that took part in this conflict, including the USA, the UK, the USSR, France, and Germany. Although Japan and Italy are also considered to be among the major nations that fought in the war, they're not going to be featured in this video as neither had a focus on tank warfare. The Japanese focused on their naval and infantry forces, while the Italians only used light tanks and tankettes. Furthermore, when possible, we'll try to take into account several of the most used tanks by said nation during the war and their overall contribution to their nation's
Okay.
war effort. France's rapid loss of the war and subsequent occupation by Germany came as much as a surprise for the French as it did for anyone else. By the beginning of the war, or at least right before the Germans invaded France, the French boasted one of the largest tank forces in the world, second only to the Soviet Union. Its tanks weren't actually much worse than any other nation's either, even Germany's. In reality, French heavy tanks were more than a match for any of the tanks the Germans fielded at the beginning of the war. In the Battle of France, for example, a single Char B1 heavy tank took on and annihilated 13 German Panzer IIIs and IVs in just a few minutes. The tank's crew even reported that the tank had been hit 140 times in the course of the battle. The Char B1 boasted 40mm armor and a 75mm howitzer gun, weighing 28 tons in total. It was one of the most powerfully armed and armored tanks of its day, and its firepower was more than enough to pierce German armor. However, this didn't prevent the German tanks from outmaneuvering the much slower French tanks. The Char B1 only had a maximum speed of 21 to 28 kilometers per hour. On the other hand, all German tanks carried radios with them, unlike French tanks, in order to maintain a solid chain of command and communications and comply with their combined arms doctrine.
Wow.
In the
Okay.
end, it was the lack of good communications that prevented the French from effectively countering Germany's advance. For these reasons, the French fall to 5th in our list.
Dang.
Although the UK built the first tanks by the beginning of World War II, they were already lagging behind in tank development. In fact, for most of the war, British troops relied on American tanks supplied to them through the Lend-Lease program. However, at the beginning of the war, they did field their own British tanks. The Mk2 was one of them. This medium tank was developed almost at the same time as the Mk1 as a heavier infantry tank version. Its armor was thicker than its predecessor, the Mk1, with a thickness of 30mm, but it carried a similar 40mm gun. The Mk2 was effectively used during the French, Greek, and early North African campaigns. Its 40mm gun made it lethal against the lighter Italian tanks and meant it could hold its ground against the early German Panzer II and III. On the downside, its light armor meant it was susceptible to most Axis anti-tank weapons. Its reliability in suspension and desert conditions were praised, as was its performance in the defense of Tobruk. However, when taken to Greece, even as they managed to effectively engage German tanks, over 90% were lost due to mechanical breakdown. The bright spot for British tank design was probably the Comet 1 and the Mk4 Churchill. The Comet 1 was a medium high-speed tank developed from the earlier Cromwell tank. Its armor could be as thick as 102mm and it featured a 76.2mm gun. It weighed 32.7 tons and could move as fast as 51 kilometers per hour.
Wow.
The Mk4 Churchill, on the other hand, was a super heavy infantry tank, well known for its heavily armored chases. It weighed 40 tons, carried a 57mm gun, and could only reach a speed of 24 kilometers per hour. However, it was designed for navigating the most uneven, shell-cratered ground, demolishing infantry obstacles and attacking enemy defenses, duties for which great speed or heavy armament were not necessary. Finally, due to the loss of France and lowered productivity from 1942 on, British units started to be equipped with tanks supplied by the US alongside their own British-designed tanks. The British would later modify the American tanks.
That doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, a lot of the equipment sent over there were from the Americans because they entered the war late. So, yeah.
Tanks supplied to them, giving birth to tanks such as the Sherman Firefly, a M4 Sherman mounted with a 76.2mm gun. When the Americans entered the war, their army virtually had no tanks, and the few they had were light tanks. The Battle of France had already proved the importance of medium tanks. French and British light tanks were destroyed by German guns, while their heavy tanks were simply outmaneuvered by the faster German tanks. So, the Americans needed a tank that was maneuverable, sturdy enough to endure enemy fire, and capable of carrying a 75mm gun into battle. Finally, they developed the medium tank M3, which would later evolve into the medium tank M4, the most used tank by Western Allied forces in World War II.
Wow.
The M4 Sherman, as the British nicknamed it, would be supplied to most of the Allied forces through the Lend-Lease program. The medium tank M4 featured 177.8mm armor, was mounted with a 75 or 76mm gun, or a 105mm howitzer, and it weighed 30.3 to 38.1 tons. These features made the M4 a formidable rival for the German Panzer IIIs and IVs. As the war progressed and the Germans deployed the Panzer V Panther and the Panzer VI Tiger, so too did the Allies need to upgrade their own tanks. The answer was the M10 and the M36 respectively. The M10 tank destroyer, officially the 3-inch gun motor carriage M10, featured a 76.2mm gun mounted in a rotating turret on a modified M4A2 Sherman tank chassis.
It's kind of cool, like as these tanks are progressing, just how like more bulkier and like I don't know, so bigger. They just seem to getting bigger and bigger as the show goes on.
It also featured 57.2mm armor and weighed 29 tons. Finally, the M36 tank destroyer, officially the 90mm gun motor carriage M36, featured a 90mm gun mounted on a massive turret on the reliable M4 Sherman chassis and sloped armor. It also featured 127mm armor and weighed 29 tons.
Okay.
By the time the Germans launched their invasion of France, their armoured force was not particularly striking. In reality, the Germans managed to conquer the country with less tanks and much less firepower than the defending French forces. However, their combined arms doctrine, their tanks' high mobility, and command and control capability gave them tactical superiority. It was during Germany's invasion of Russia that German tanks met their match. During Operation Barbarossa, the Germans bitterly discovered that the Soviet T-34 outclassed the Panzer III and IV. Its sloped armor could endure most of the German weapons, and its gun could penetrate German tank armor. This forced the Germans to develop heavier tanks, such as the Panzer V Panther. For its impressive firepower and excellent armor, this tank is usually considered one of the best fielded throughout the Second World War. The Panzer V Panther was clad on 100mm armor and featured a 75mm gun. While the Panther's gun caliber was common among the Allies, its gun was the most powerful of the war. Only the British Sherman Firefly 76.2mm gun had more potential armor penetration, although it was much less accurate than the Panther. Another of Germany's tank division's jewels was the Tiger I. This incredibly heavy tank outclassed all Allied tanks in terms of firepower and armor when it was first deployed in 1942. It featured an impressive 88mm gun and was clad on 120mm of thick armor. The Tiger I was later replaced by the Tiger II, which was more heavily armored and made use of armor sloping, as did the Panther. The problem with the German tank design was that, in their effort to achieve technological superiority over the Allies, they were over-engineered. They tended to use expensive materials and complicated production methods, which made them very difficult to maintain and repair when they broke down.
Damn.
The Soviet Union started and ended the war with the largest tank fleet in the world.
I was, because in the video game World of Tanks, it was I used the Tiger I and Tiger II, and I don't know, it's always seemed to get its butt kicked in that game, at least, you know. I was like, dang, why'd I choose this line?
World. In 1939, the most common Soviet tank was the T-26, which was only lightly armored, but fitted with a 45mm gun, could penetrate most German armor. Very few of them had radios, and this proved to be as big an issue as it was for the French. Once again, Germany's combined arms doctrine, along with its command and control capabilities.
Yeah, it doesn't make much sense for a tank not to have a radio. I mean, you're just kind of like, what'd they do? Just following the army kind of thing, or just kind of they know what direction they're going, and that's it. Like, it just seems like common sense, so someone can kind of call for help or like tell someone like what direction to go if something is seen. I don't know. I can definitely see why the Germans took down the French really easily with their tanks, considering they can communicate and all that stuff, and the French were kind of almost like sitting ducks as far as what they should do.
Gave them tactical superiority. Not only were the Soviets materially unprepared for war at the time of the invasion, but their army was in almost complete disarray after the purges of the officer class of the 1930s. In the first months of the invasion, the Soviets suffered heavy losses at the hands of the German forces, mainly due to lack of coordination, training, and unpreparedness for the war. Although the Germans were initially successful in their advance, when the Soviets managed to reorganize themselves, the T-34 played a major role in halting the German offensive in 1942. The T-34 was instrumental in the execution of the double encirclement maneuver that cut off the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. Surrounded, the 6th Army surrendered, dealing a major blow to the Germans. This is regarded as a turning point for the war on the Eastern Front. When it was first deployed and with its 76.2mm gun, the T-34 was unmatched by any of the German tanks it came up against. In fact, all standard German anti-tank weapons were ineffective against its heavy, sloped armor, to the point where the standard German anti-tank gun was nicknamed Panzer-Anklopfgerät, as when fight against the T-34, they would just give away their position without causing any damage to the tank. It was also very inexpensive and easily repaired. This meant they could produce large quantities of the T-34s and meet the demand of tanks needed to halt the German invasion. Its impact on the war and its enemies was such that Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist, commander of the 1st Panzer Army during Operation Barbarossa, called it the finest tank in the world, and Life magazine wrote, "The best tanks in the world today are probably the Russian tanks."
Wow.
But of course, guys, this is just our opinion here on the channel, and we completely understand. If you do have a different opinion, make sure you type it down in the comments section below. We're always keen to read your replies and respond to them. And just before you go, guys, if you want to join the wider history community, make sure you check out our Discord link in the description.
Oh wow, Russia takes number one. I was totally surprised. I don't know why though. I shouldn't be, but just for some, I guess just for some reason. Maybe it's just like, I don't know, some movies I've seen or whatnot. But okay, surprised me. I'm impressed, Russia. I mean, well, I guess Soviet Union. But anyways, guys, let me know your thoughts below on because yes, I thought Tiger Tank. I should like said it didn't seem to be that great in the game I played, but it's definitely a well-known, I guess, tank. I guess I should be like the Sherman. I guess I thought was going to be up there too, but again, I guess I really don't know much about other tanks, so that's my own fault. But anyways, definitely surprised and definitely interesting. I guess they kind of went pretty in depth on like the armor and like the guns and stuff, and I was just kind of like soaking it in. But anyways, guys, please hit that like and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts below in the comments, like you guys always do. And I'll catch you guys in a future video. I am out of here. Peace.